We got a lot tonight at Long Branch, as I understand it, and so we're missing them terribly, but it is good to see you. Good to be back. Had a great morning at Southside down the road, and a great group of brethren down there, and had a good morning, good lunch, and good afternoon service. And many of you have already been here twice today, and so this makes your third time here, and thankful you could come back tonight. I know the Long boys back here are ready. I know we hadn't got as many kids as we normally have, but I know they're ready, okay, for these questions. So I know I'm going to have help. So if any of the rest of you kiddos in here shout the answer out to me when I ask the question. We're in Exodus chapter 2 tonight, and probably got to save a few gummies since the other ones were gone to Long Branch, right? Probably won't be as many chewing on gummies during the sermon. Exodus chapter 2, we got Moses now, and the first thing we learn from Exodus chapter 2 is where his lineage came from. So what tribe was both of his parents from? Levi. I told y'all they were ready. I done heard them. Levi. So Moses was a prophet, and of course a priest. It was a prophet, priest from that tribe of Levi. From both sides, mother and father came from Levi there. Moses is given the name Moses because it is significant in its meaning. That's why he's called Moses. He was actually given that by Pharaoh's daughter. And what does the name Moses mean? Pulled or drawn out of water. And that's significant because he was in the water, right? In the basket, in the reeds along the river's edge there. And when she pulled him out, and she ended up giving him the name Moses based on the meaning there. And that's mentioned in Exodus chapter 2. Moses gets upset in Exodus chapter 2, and he finds an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, some of his own people, and he lets his anger get the best of him, and he kills the Egyptian. And the next day he sees another quarrel, and word's already spread. And they're asking him, are you going to kill us too? And so he knows that he has done something very terrible, and he knows that his life could be in danger. Someone could try to take his life as a punishment, and so he flees. Where does he flee to? Midian. And he's going to stay 40 years in Midian, and there he's going to find a wife and have a couple of children, and of course, as the timeline unfolds, obviously those 40 years are very key to Moses being prepared to come back in to Egypt and help get the Israelites out. And so Exodus chapter 2, we're just getting started there, but those were our questions for tonight. Our devotional book deals with the end part of the book of Acts for this week. In Acts 22 beginning, Paul is on trial. We're coming down toward the end of the book of Acts, obviously, and we're coming down toward the end of the life of the great apostle Paul. And these missionary journeys, 3 of them have occurred. And so now he is giving a defense for what he's teaching and preaching, and he really is on trial. Chapter 22, he's talking to the people and kind of explaining himself to the people. In chapter 23, he's carried before the council, and so it goes from just a generic crowd, if you will, in chapter 22 to apparently the leadership, the council of leaders among the Roman people, ultimately leading him up to at the end of chapter 23, all the way to the governor. Felix was the governor, and so by the end of chapter 23, he's taken. He's been released a couple times, but then goes into the I guess, the quarters of the next official. And so it just kind of, it's similar, although Jesus kind of went back and forth a little bit. Paul just kind of goes through the steps, if you will, of the government there, leading up to Felix in chapter 24 and being before Felix, making an appeal to Caesar, which is pretty significant there at the end of chapter 24, as I see it, based on what Jimmy read a moment ago about his Roman citizenship and his right to appeal to Caesar, and then as he's trying to convince Felix of this, as Jimmy read for us, ultimately he's going to get to Caesar. Felix is not going to do anything with him, as we learned from the Bible reading, but should have, because of his appeal back in chapter 22 to his Roman citizenship. Finally, in chapter 25, he gets that opportunity to go before Caesar as a Roman, ultimately leading up to chapter 26 and his appearance before Agrippa. And so for a time there in chapter 25, he's before Agrippa and Bernice, and then in chapter 26, he is defending himself. So it's just one big, long trial. Chapter 27, we're going to get on the boat and head toward Rome. So 27, 28, we're going to be making that journey. But 22 to 26 is this big, long trial. Twice in this particular section of Scripture, Paul gives his conversion story. And so that's why you have 3 times in the book of Acts. You have when it originally occurred in Acts chapter 9, on the road to Damascus, when Paul was blinded by the Lord and had the conversation. But then in Acts 22 and in Acts 26, he gives the retelling of that story again. And so all 3 times there in the book of Acts. What are we taking away from this? Well, I mentioned back there in chapter 22 his appeal to his Roman citizenship. Now they've got him, they've arrested him, they're trying to figure out what's the deal with this Jew. They're trying to figure out why the Jews are mad at one of their own fellow people, and so the Romans are going to take care of this, and they're going to settle this matter because the Jews aren't strong enough, if you will, from an authority standpoint to take care of their business or to take care of their troublemakers. And so they're just going to step in, and the Romans are just going to handle this, and all will be great. Well, the problem is that up there in Acts 22, beginning in verse 22 and following, down to verse 25, Paul mentions to the centurion, hey, I'm a Roman. Whoa, wait a minute, what? So the tribune, verse 27 rather, comes in and says, tell me you're a Roman citizen? And he said, yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. And so they said, well, who'd you buy it from? What large sum did you pay? Because obviously it paid dividends to be a Roman citizen, because now they can't just do anything they want to with him. He's got to go through the due process that happens throughout the next 5 chapters thanks to this fact. Now, if he's a Jew, they just off with his head and boom, done. He doesn't matter. But because he's a Roman citizen now, everything changes. Paul says, I'm a citizen by birth. I didn't buy anything. So they were about to examine him. They withdrew. They were afraid of him because they realized that he was a Roman citizen. I just bring this up, obviously, because it's going to tailspin into the rest of the week, if you will. This is ultimately what sets off the next 4 chapters. But also to think about for just a moment, what are my rights as a citizen? As an American. Much like in the days of Paul, it pays to be an American citizen. There are people paying dear money to try to gain citizenship in the country to which you and I were born in. And so there are some wonderful rights that come from being a citizen of this country. But with those rights also come responsibility. And so we have some responsibilities as an American citizen. And so as you think about Paul's Roman citizenship, and certainly he appeals to it here, and rightfully so. There's been times in my life when I've appealed to the fact that I'm an American citizen. And that's been important, and it's been able to get me through some hoops and hurdles, and because America's respected, and in most places they take good care of us. There are a few places I've been where I probably didn't want to tell them I was an American citizen, but a very few. And so you appeal to your birthright citizenship, and it's a good thing. But with that right, then comes the responsibility of being the citizen that God wants us to be. And so you go back to chapter 4 and chapter 5. Obviously, the apostles said, we'll obey God rather than man. But we want to be bold in your prayer. In other words, we want to be as responsible as citizens as we can be, as long as you allow us to be. And so we understand our citizenship in this country comes with rights and responsibilities. But ultimately, and many of you were here this afternoon, ultimately you know where our citizenship is. And I just call your mind back to that passage that I read in the memorial service in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. Our citizenship is in heaven. Because we are citizens of heaven, guess what? That comes with some rights, but it also comes with some responsibilities. And so we need to know the blessings of being a citizen of heaven. We also need to know what the responsibilities are and be fulfilling our responsibilities as a citizen of heaven. I love Acts 23 and verse 11. I don't really have much to say about it. Paul is in turmoil. What's about to happen to me? I really want to go to Rome. He wrote that Roman letter, and all through that letter he's saying, guys, I really want to come. I really love to visit. I hear a lot about you. I really appreciate you. I know you're working in a difficult situation. I know it's hard to tear down the wall of Jew and Gentile, and on and on and on and on. And so that desires that he really wants to go visit the brethren at Rome, and he really thinks for all practical purposes he's about to die. And rightfully so. And 23:11 is just the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. It's just a little snippet of assurance. Paul, this is where you want to go. This is where you're going to go. Now, by this time in your Bible, you're seeing very little red ink if you have red letter Bibles. What you might notice is that Acts 23 and verse 11 is red ink. There's not much of that at this point. My point is that, the Lord's saying very little at this point directly to man. And so what he is saying to them, I think, is just unique and important, just to stop and pause, and just the reassurance that the Lord gives here on the following night, that Paul had been there before the council and giving. And of course, they began then to plot, to try to kill him. And so he goes before Felix ultimately, and you come down to the end of chapter 24 in the Bible reading a moment ago. And he'd been with Felix for some days now, according to verse 24. And after some days, Felix goes in to his wife, and he's talking to his wife, and he's trying to figure out what is it about this Jewish guy? She's a Jew. Why do they, not like Paul? What's the problem? Can you explain this to me? And here's the explanation. Paul is a man who is preaching. Look at verse 25. There's a 3-point sermon in verse 25, by the way. Number one, he was preaching righteousness. If you want a good biblical sermon, let me tell you how to get one. Talk about righteousness. God is righteous. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Righteousness. He was talking about a life of right living. And those who weren't living right, guess what? They got mad at him. It's only natural. He was talking about, number two, self-control. the fruits of the Spirit, among which self-control, right? It is an attribute to be desired and one to hold on to and one to try to grow in, to be able to control oneself. Guess what? People who don't like to control themselves, they're going to get mad. You start talking about all this denial of self stuff and being able to say no and being able to put off the appetites of the body and the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and being able to not love those things or want those things, being able to discipline yourself. Oh, those are some terrible topics, right? So Paul is going around preaching righteousness and self-control. Surely number 3 is going to be something like love and joy and peace and happiness, right? No, it's not. Look at verse 25. Coming judgment. Whew. Well, there's you a sermon to try to preach. Let's talk about how important it is to be righteous, because God is righteous. God is holy. Let's talk about the desire that God has for you and I to practice self-control in all of our lives, in every day, in every moment, and how difficult that is for humanity. And now let's talk about, hey, if you don't live righteously and control yourself, the impending doom of coming judgment is awful. What's about to transpire for your soul eternally is a devil's hell. Now, there ain't nothing easy about any of that. And that's his sermon. That's what he's reasoning with them about. And Felix naturally becomes alarmed, as any others would who were not serving the Lord and trying to live right. The judgment coming is not something to look forward to when you're not ready for the judgment to come. And so that's why he sends him away. Maybe I'll have an opportunity somewhere down the road. I'll summon you back. Really, all he wanted was money from him. Did you hear what Jimmy read? And so for 2 years went by, and you think you were busy. Felix was really busy. He didn't have any time for 2 solid years. Now the reality of it was he wasn't going to make time. He wasn't going to take time. Oh, he had opportunity. He refused to take the opportunity, because he didn't want to hear about having to live righteously and to be a man of self-control and to prepare himself for the judgment that was coming. And so he just leaves him in prison to try to satisfy the Jews. Acts 25, verse 19. Again, not much here, just want to point this out. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with Paul about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead. But Paul told them he was alive. Well, that's a clear problem, right? If a man's supposed to be dead and somebody's telling you he's alive, we got an issue, right? Don't tell me we don't have an issue. We still debating over whether Elvis is dead or not. Somebody come along a few days later and said, he ain't dead, he's still alive. And look, we're decades removed from that, and we're still debating whether he's dead or alive, okay? Now, if you think Elvis caused a stir, what do you think about Jesus, right? This man's supposed to be dead, and now here Paul is going around telling everybody, he ain't dead. I saw him. I talked to him. He's alive. And obviously you can imagine the reaction that he's getting and the rejection that he's getting from those Jews who claimed that he was in fact dead and therefore he was not the Messiah because he was not raised, when in fact Paul knew better. So then I want to call your attention to Acts 26, beginning in verse 24. Now, Paul has finally come before Agrippa. And he's in the presence of the king here, and I love verse 1. Agrippa says to Paul, and this is coming from a king now to a prisoner on trial, okay? Paul has zero authority here. As a matter of fact, the king owes him nothing. And lo and behold, he gives him permission to speak. Now here's Paul standing in the presence of the king, who all he's got to do is give down the edict and it's done. No questions asked. If he wants Paul de-limbed one limb at a time, no questions asked. And instead of using his power and authority to tell Paul what he thinks, in verse 1 he says, okay, Paul, talk to me. It's just amazing to me. Obviously, it's the providence of God. It's the protection of God. It's God, watching out for Paul and giving Paul the opportunity. Because when Paul speaks in Acts 26, he tells Agrippa about his life and what all he'd done and how he'd done that, and he thought he was doing right, and then lo and behold, one day he was on the road to Damascus. It happened in Acts chapter 9. He was looking for people that were of the way, and he was ready to drag them off to prison and chain them up. And he come in contact with the Lord. And he tells Agrippa that story. And he tells that conversion, and he quotes the Lord there. You'll see some red letters there as Paul is quoting from what originally took place in Acts chapter 9. And then he tells him in verse 19, I was not disobedient. In other words, I did exactly what the heavenly vision told me to do. As he was saying these things, verse 24, Festus now says with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. Paul said, no, sir, I'm not out of my mind. I'm telling you what's true and what's rational. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped from his knowledge, for this has not been done in a corner. Paul says, this wasn't some big secret somewhere. I was literally out on the road traveling. I went in to Damascus. I was taught the way. 3 days. Then I got my eyesight back. I obeyed the gospel. I went to Jerusalem. They tried to kick me out. Barnabas took me in. They accepted me. I've traveled the known world 3 different occasions with multiple travel companions. Festus, I'm not out of my mind. There's multiple people that can attest to what's going on. King Agrippa, do you believe? I know that you believe. And King Agrippa says to Paul in verse 28 of Acts 26, in a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian? Now, I realize there's a song there that says, almost thou persuadest me. The reality of it is that King Agrippa is trying to appease Festus, and he's trying to appease God, and he's trying to appease Paul, and he can't do it all. And so what he's saying there is, Paul, do you really think in just these few short moments that you're going to convince me? Paul says, verse 29, I don't know whether it's short or long, but I would to God that not only you, but also who hear me might become such as I am, with the exception of these chains. Here's a man who's been on trials for days now. He's could lose his life at any moment. The king says, talk to me. Paul begins to talk. And then he's interrupted by Festus, to which comes down to the conclusion of this, do you believe what I'm telling you? And Agrippa says, you're going to have to give me a little more time. And Paul says, take all the time you want, but just realize we may not have all the time you want. My one desire is that all people become like I am as a child of God. I want everyone that I know, Paul says, to have a conversion story. No, it won't be like his. His is one of a kind, unique, miraculous, divine, providential. Ours won't be like his, but he's saying, I want everyone to become like I am. As a member of the family of God, obviously, I don't want them to be in prison and under trial, so with the exception of these chains that I'm in. In such a short time. You see, there's biblical proof for long sermons, okay? Short sermons won't convert anybody. But I'm done for today, okay? That's about all you're going to get, all right? It'll be what it is. My prayer is that whatever the time, short or long, that you and I are all ready to meet the Lord. That's our one goal, our only goal, our main goal, is that you and I are faithfully serving the Lord. I want nothing more from you, and I expect you to want nothing more from me than to be a faithful servant of God. Like Paul, who with boldness is willing to speak for the resurrected Lord all the time, anytime. Live a life following the example of the resurrected Lord. I hope that's who you are. And I want you to be confident in the fact that that's who I am. If there's anything tonight that might be amidst in your life to where you're not being that faithful servant of the Lord, don't be almost persuaded, right? Not sure it says that there, but that's okay. Don't be almost serving the Lord. Don't be almost ready to go to heaven. Don't be almost anything. Be fully convinced. Be ready. Be on guard. Be watching. If we can help you with anything tonight, would you come while we stand and sing?